Hey, it's Brian Burns. Welcome to this episode of the B2B Revenue Leadership Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about creativity. And a lot of us in marketing and sales may think that this is a fixed characteristic that we're born with, like our height or a color of our eyes or our hair. But what we're finding out is that it's something that's more of on a continuum, something that you can develop and cultivate. And I've got the author of a book on the creativity code, Alan Gannett, and we have a pretty interesting conversation and very different views on it. But I think we really surface a lot of issues, and Alan's a great guy, and I loved discussing it with him, and I'd love your feedback on this. Before I get into it, though, I want to make sure I thank all the people that have helped me get the show out there, all the people connecting up with me on LinkedIn, sharing my content, following the LinkedIn podcast pages, which are company pages, B2B, Revenue, Brutal Truth, Sales Questions, and Career Advice. Really appreciate that. And also, I want to make sure you're checking out CoVideo. CoVideo is my video email solution that I'm using, that I recommend to my customers. And it is so much more engaging. This is the year of video. I'm doing it on Instagram. I'm doing it on LinkedIn, YouTube. I love the podcast. Podcast is nice, passive way to consume content, but it's not, as visual, obviously. It's good that you can plug into your ears, but when you really want to connect with somebody, you want to see them. And if you can't see them in person, a video is the second best thing. We're all walking around with these 4K cameras in our pocket, and we might as well take advantage of it. So make sure you're checking out covideo.com. Also, I want to make sure you're checking out nudge.ai. It's the great way for me to monitor my total addressable market and do it automatically using artificial intelligence. They've given a coupon code to the podcast listeners, Brutal Truth. And that coupon code, Brutal Truth, also works with Pipedrive, which is my CRM. And it keeps track of everything for me, integrates in with my email system, completes my contacts, gives me intelligence about what's going on in my marketplace. So make sure you're checking out those. You get a free month with the Brutal Truth coupon code. Let's get into the interview with Alan. Hey, Alan, thanks for joining us today. As a way of getting started, tell us about yourself.
Thanks for having me, Brian. My name is Alan Gannett, and I run a company called TrackMaven. We're a big data platform for consumer marketers. So we help a lot of big brands you've heard of and love, like NBA, Honda, GE. We've helped them actually find what are the patterns in their marketing data. And from there, being able to figure out, okay, what should we do more of? What should we do less of? And I have coming out on June 12th, my first book, which is all about, I've always been fascinated by the sort of application of like systems and structure within creativity and within marketing. And so the book is really diving deep into that and looking at this question of whether or not creativity is something that can be learned. And if so, how can we actually learn it? And so, yeah, that's me.
Sounds cool. It sounds like just the opposite of analytics, though, doesn't it?
Well, no, because I'm saying that there is actually
analytics,
data and system. And, oh, yeah, there's a whole, one of the big mythologies we have in Western culture is we think that creativity is this nebulous, organic thing with no rhyme or reason. But this is actually wrong. It's actually, there's a lot of science around creativity. We actually know a lot about how creativity works. And, for example, we have this sort of misattribution in Western culture that, creativity is this sort of thing for, these, people who win the genetic lottery. They pop out of the womb with all this talent, but there's actually a ton of science around creativity from neuroscience, psychology, anthropology, sociology. And what we know is that creativity is actually a learnable, nurturable skill, and there's a lot of studies that show that. And so there's this big misunderstanding of creativity that I personally want to sort of break down.
And what was your motivation for that?
I think, I work with a lot of marketers, and so I got frustrated hearing, something like, hey, I'm not that creative. And I'm like, what? What do you mean you're not that creative? Creativity is not a fixed asset. You can become more creative. And I realized that we've sort of over-internalized the sort of like magazine cover version of creativity, which is that, well, there's some people like Elon Musk and they're creative and look how special they are and no one else is like that. And that's just not how creativity actually works. Creativity actually, and is a much longer, it's a book length discussion, but creativity is really something that, first of all, is a social construct. So in order for something to be labeled creative, we all have to agree that it's creative, which means as a result that creativity is not this thing that's actually internal. It's actually external. It's actually how people perceive our work, how people perceive us, how they think about us. And since it's this social construct, there's all these community elements to how creativity works. And it's actually much more about how other people interrelate to you and how other people perceive your work and how is your work timed and how is it presented. And there's all these elements to creativity that we don't really understand if we just sort of read, airport magazines.
And do you think we've lost a lot of the creativity in marketing? We outsourced it?
Yeah, I think, totally. I mean, a lot of marketers say, well, if I want to be creative, I have to hire an agency to be creative.
Yeah.
And I think that this is an excuse. I think that since we think that creativity is easy for some people, and since it's hard for us, well, then I'm just not even going to try. We use it as an excuse. But the reality is that, for most people, when you think about things like child prodigies, the thing is, for example, think about Mozart. Mozart's sort of a famous example of a child prodigy. The thing is that it wasn't that it was always easy for him. It's that he literally started when he was 3 years old. And his dad was basically a helicopter dad, forcing him to literally play piano 3 hours every single day with the best music teachers in all of Europe. So, if you were doing that since you were 3, you'd be pretty good by the time you were an adult. That doesn't mean that it was always easy for little Mozart. It just means that his dad forced him through the hard parts. And so I think as adults often when we're approaching new skills, we sort of mistake the fact that things are initially difficult for the idea that they're impossible. And that's a very, very dangerous way to frame the world around you.
And so you think people kind of get set in their box of...
100%.
Yeah.
They tell themselves... we have this idea in our culture that things are easy for other people. And so if things aren't easy for us, well, then we must not be passionate about them. We must not be talented. We must not be, fill in the blank here. And the reality is that, passion, quote unquote, is really for most people, when you're really good at something and you apply an additional unit of energy and you get an additional unit of sort of improvement from that. But the thing is that for most people, those are the things that when they were very young, someone sort of encouraged them and pushed them through the parts that were difficult to get them there, right? People don't, sit down at a piano for the first time unprompted and somehow play the piano. It doesn't work for anyone like that. And so we forget that for all of us, at some point, things are difficult. But if we want to get good at things, if we want to develop passion for that, we have to bust through that. And so in the book, I talk about that if you want to actually learn new creative skills as an adult, one of the most important things is to surround yourselves with other people who have those same creative interests. Because one, they'll help give you that emotional support to push you through the hard things. But then two, they'll actually also give you friendly competition. They'll also actually motivate you and say, shit, well, if he or she is doing that creative task, I want to be able to do that. And you need to find those ways to get yourself over the initial hump. I have a friend who, when I was writing this book, sort of said, hey, well, that's good and all, but, I'm never going to be a great dancer. And I said, Joe, have you ever taken a dancing lesson? He's like, no. I'm like, then how do you know? He's like, well, I'm just not good at it. I'm like, yeah, no shit. You've never ever done it. Yep. So of course you're not good at it. And if you ever want to be inspired, go on YouTube, and there's an entire genre of YouTube videos of people doing sort of before and after voice lessons. So there's they'll sing and then 12 months later they'll sing again after 12 months of voice lessons. And it's amazing. These people who literally sing like me, they're terrible, go to sounding like angels. And you see this over and over again, is that we really underestimate our ability as humans to learn and adapt and to achieve new things.
And who are you applying this book to, or who do you hope reads this? I mean, is it attached to your business, or is it just a passion project?
Yeah, so it's attached to the business. I mean, originally it was a book just for marketers. Yeah. But as I was working on the book, I realized that all creatives have similar dilemmas and frustrations. So whether that's a fine artist, a poet, a novelist, an entrepreneur. And so the book is really sort of geared towards any creative, but there's a lot of the book inherently, since it's a business book, does have direct applications to entrepreneurs, CEOs, and corporate marketers. That's sort of the primary audience of the book.
Were you frustrated working with them in that they are today mostly cookie cutter, kind of copycatting, because it kind of fits into that, because to get out of the box means that they're going to be judged. And
so one of the things, I think is so interesting is that there's actually two different types of ways that people mess up creativity. So a lot of artists mess up creativity, and then they actually try and be too new.
Yeah.
They try and do things that are too novel. And the thing they forget is that when you actually look at the science around consumer preference and consumer taste, we actually like things that are a blend of familiar and new.
Yep.
We don't like things that are radically new, and we don't like things that are radically familiar. Corporate marketers and corporate executives tend to do the opposite. They tend to focus on making things that are overly familiar, right? They're overly copycat, they're overly similar, and they're very fearful of creating or adding a novelty to what they're doing. And so the real magic for anyone who wants to create a new product, a message, a campaign, whatever it is to blend familiarity and novelty. Those are the ideas that actually we like. Those are the ideas that take off in culture. You think about, Star Wars when it first came out. It was literally a Western in space. Like, that's what it was.
Yeah.
Right now, the food trend that's sort of taking over America is the sushi burrito. I don't know if you've had one yet. They're delicious, but it's familiar, but it's novel. It's sushi, but it's in a burrito form. Those are how we actually come to like new ideas. We like it when they're a little bit familiar and a little bit novel. And as someone who works in a big company, that should be exciting, because it means that your job is not to create something so radically new that it's, completely off the reservation. Your job is just to create that little novel twist.
And I think that's certainly needed, because everything looks the same today, doesn't it? I mean, every blog post looks identical. Every trade show looks identical. Every podcast seems to be identical in a lot of ways. What experiments have you been playing with?
Yeah, I mean, the thing for me is, there's sort of a meta thing, right? So in writing the book, for example, I tried to do something different where, the typical sort of business book / pop psychology book, which this is definitely in, sort of makes like the first chapter is like the point, and then every additional chapter is like a story supporting the point, which I got very bored with. Yeah. And so for this book, what I tried to do is pretend each chapter is its own little book. And so every chapter, there's more you learn. It's an onion. The more you dig in, the more you learn. It's not repetitive at all. And so that was my sort of twist on the format. But otherwise, the book has a lot of the classical elements of the genre, right? There's a lot of science, there's stories, there's narratives. I interviewed a lot of really successful, famous creative people. So I interviewed, billionaires like David Rubenstein. I interviewed startup moguls like, Kevin Ryan, who did MongoDB, Guild and Business Insider. I interviewed Alexis Ohanian, the founder of Reddit. And so the book has a lot of classical elements of the genre, but also takes a fresh approach to how you tell these stories and how you hopefully make it a lot more engaging for the reader throughout the book. So that's on the book side. And then in terms of my business, for example, we sell marketing software to marketers, so it's kind of meta. And so, we, for example, have found that a lot of the campaigns we do now, we try and be just a lot more human. Yeah. So, for example, we did at a trade show last year, we talk a lot about in our marketing how marketers shouldn't just guess their way to success. They shouldn't just throw spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks. So one thing we did this year was we got a giant target and we got 20 pounds of cooked spaghetti and a giant spoon, and we had marketers at this conference throw spaghetti against the wall and see what stuck. And it was like this huge hit. Like, people took all these photos with it, they posted it, got people excited coming by the booth. So just adding in that more human element for us in sort of B2B marketing has been really successful.
That is creative. Now, did you come up with that, or was it somebody on your team, or?
Someone on my team.
Yeah. And how do you build that into your culture? Because, I've first noticed you on LinkedIn. You do a great job with videos without, just simple selfies and stuff like that. Very engaging. How do you build it into your culture?
Yeah, so for us, it's really about embracing failure and saying that it's okay to mess up, right? It doesn't mean it's okay to always fail, right? You can't have a 0% hit rate. But if your hit rate's 100%, it probably means you're not trying hard enough. You know what I mean? Like, you need to have those failures to show that you're trying something new, you're pushing on the edge. And so celebrating failure, recognizing failure is not a bad thing. Not, we don't hold people down because they had a project that failed, but making it really clear, like, you should have stuff that fails if you're pushing hard enough.
And when you were interviewing these, very successful people, what pattern did you find?
Oh my God! So you just opened a giant can of worms. So basically, in the book, the first half of the book is deconstructing the Western notion of creativity and explaining through science and stories around how creativity actually works. The second half of the book is why I interview these 25 famous creative geniuses. These are, billionaires, Oscar winners, Tony Award winners, Grammy winners, and I explain across these interviews there was 4 patterns I found, 4 things that I found that all of these creatives did to actually improve their creativity, actually get better at it. And so, it's a book-length discussion, but a couple of things I think are really interesting is one of the things is that often when we talk about creativity, we talk about it in this sort of like as if it's an antithesis to being a consumer. Like, there's this social media meme you might have seen that is goes something like this: 90% of people consume, 9% of people engage, 1% of people consume. Or create. 1% of people create. #hustle. And it's so stupid. Yeah. And it's not just stupid because it's, cheesy. It's also stupid because it's wrong. One of the things I found when I was interviewing these great creators is they're actually some of the biggest consumers of culture. They're very, very focused on consuming culture because that's how they know what is the right balance of familiar and novel. And they don't just consume, they don't consume in a very general horizontal way. They actually go very, very, very deep on a very specific thing. They're very sort of like maladjusted when it comes to their consumption. They, they're sort of over-focused on one little thing. But that's how you master that balance of familiarity and novelty, is by really being an expert in your niche. And so that was one of the things I thought was most surprising, was just how much time, these great creators, how much time they spend consuming.
And when you say consuming, define that.
So what I mean is actually, basically they actually will go and take, for example, I interviewed Ted Sarandos, the chief content officer of Netflix. He tells me a story of how when he was 18 years old, he became a clerk at a video rental store. He literally watched every single video in the store. Yeah. That was his thing he did during the day when it was empty. J.K. Rowling, had this sort of stressed out childhood between her parents were always fighting, and so she would lock herself in her bedroom and just read books and books and books and books and books. She was known for when she went to college, she had library fines for having so many books out. So they just ingest lots and lots of raw material, and that's part of how they understand and learn this balance of what is familiar and what is novel, is by being these sort of super consumers.
But there are also people who do that don't become creative, aren't there?
Oh, 100%. So one of the things I talk about in the book is that, in the second pattern I bring up, is it's not just how much you consume, but it's also how you consume. So typically, when you or I consume something, like if you and I watch a movie, we're sort of in the role of suspending disbelief. We're wanting to be taken away. These great creators, they consume in a different way. They consume in this very tactile, this very interactive way. They assess what they're watching or reading or listening to as they're doing it. And so, I talk about in the book this story about how Ben Franklin wrote in his autobiography about how he learned how to become a great writer. He actually took magazine articles that he loved, and he literally outlined how are they structured. Did they start with a quote? Did they start with an anecdote? Did they start with the main point? Did they start with a supporting detail? And he touched and felt his way to learn the structure of these great creative works. Kurt Vonnegut at one point tried to get a master's degree in anthropology, which, by the way, he stopped because he said, and I quote, "I didn't realize how stupid primitive people were." But as part of this master's degree, he wrote a thesis. And his thesis, what he did is he took great novels and he actually mapped out on a chart the positive and negative emotional valence of these different stories. And he found there's these 4 recurring story arcs that people used over and over again. And so these great creators, when they consume, it's this very tactile way of consuming where they're learning what is that structure, what is that framework, what is that, dare I say, that formula of these great creative works, and they use that as the baseline, right? They're not starting from scratch because they understand that great creative work is the balance of the familiar and the novel. They use these structures as the baseline for their success.
Now, I'm a huge movie fan and a huge mystery fan, and I used to watch murder shows with no volume on so I could try and guess who the villain was. Because I could, because obviously they would interview each suspect. And then you could watch how they reacted to the questions and, just kind of their behavior. So I love this. But then, what got me on the movie side was, why did Godfather 3 fail? Maybe this is too, you're too young to remember this, but, Godfather 1, one of the best movies ever. Godfather 2, arguably the best movie ever made. Godfather 3, a C-level movie at best. Right? You have the same director, a lot of the same actors.
One of the things that's really interesting is that there's some artists, there's some creators who are one-hit wonders, and there's some that seem to over and over again be able to create these great successes, and they seem to be able to change with the times. And the thing is that I actually talk about this study in the book, that there's this professor, Thomas Urola, who is an empirical musicologist. So he's a researcher who studies the math behind music. And he did this one study where he actually mapped out on a chart the Beatles' use of experimental song features. And what he found is that the Beatles were very good at adopting new musical trends, using them until their audience gets satiated from them, and then stop using them and moving on to other things. Yeah. And this sort of constant reinvention in just the right balance, right? Because you don't want to be too new, you don't want to be too familiar, is what drives people to be long-term creative hits. Like, they're not just one-hit wonders. There's some people who create, and they have to luck their way into timing, and they create one thing or two things that are really good, but at some point, they stop innovating the right amount, and it becomes too familiar, or they try something that's so new that's too avant-garde. And so what you see with these great creative geniuses is this ability to transform themselves as their audience transforms. And one of the things I talk about in the book that I was really surprised by is when I interviewed these great creatives is that, we have this notion that, these creators are going off into the woods and going to a cabin and writing the great American novel in isolation and then coming out when they type the words, the end. Yep. The thing is that I actually found the great creators are actually the ones who are the most feedback driven, because they understand that their job as a creator is the relationship with the audience. It is creating things that are the right balance of familiar and novel for the audience. And so these great creators are constantly obsessed with this question of, okay, is this right? Right? Am I overdoing it? Am I overplaying it? Am I pushing things in the right way? They become obsessed with the social contract of creativity, not the creative item in and of itself.
And because I see this applying to marketing and sales, and I also see it as the challenge with products like yours, is that when you take analytics of marketing, how do you make sense of what's vanity versus what's effective, right?
So,
go ahead.
So I think the thing when it comes to marketing, there's different roles of marketing. Obviously, I like to make it really simplistic. I like to think about awareness, engagement, and conversion as the 3 areas that marketing plays in. And sometimes you have campaigns or ideas that play within all 3 of those, and sometimes they're just one. And so, one person's vanity is another person's strategy. It just depends how you use it. So if you're only ever doing marketing that's focused on awareness and you're never converting them, well, you're probably just not spending money very well. Like, that's just stupid. But if you're only focused on conversion and never focused on awareness, you're trying to get ROI from an audience that probably doesn't actually exist. And so you really have to, I find, the best marketing teams really are good at balancing those three things and doing all three in parallel. And you're actually starting to see some marketing organizations, I think, are very savvy that actually are organizing their marketing teams around funnel stages, so that instead of organizing their marketing teams by channel, which I think is sort of a relic of the sort of more traditional marketing times, now they're organizing their marketing teams by funnel stage and having cross-functional teams within those.
And what will somebody get out of this book? Because I think everybody wants to be more creative. Are you scared that people will look at this and say, like, that's not my bag?
So there's something I want people to get out of it. There's something I'm worried they'll make a mistake about. So what I want people to get out of it is this understanding that there is a logic and rationality to creativity, to what becomes hits, to whom's deemed creative in our culture. And I want them to understand that. What I don't want them to take away from it is that I'm not saying that it's easy. In fact, I'm saying it's incredibly difficult. And I think the fact that we think that for some people it's easy gives us an excuse not to try as hard as we should. Yeah. And so my goal is for you to take away that, yes, there is a path for you to become a creative success, but it's incredibly difficult, and you have to be willing to sign up for the work. There's no silver bullets when it comes to creativity.
And how much of it do you see as art versus science?
I reject the premise of the question. I think those two things are inherently intertwined. I think there is a scientific background to all art and to why we like certain art at different times. And so, yeah, I reject the premise.
but you can't. But let me give you an example. Every great chef in the world has written a cookbook, right? So that would mean that anybody who reads that cookbook and follows the instructions could become a great chef, right? But there's, you see where I'm going with this?
Yes, and I'd say you can with enough work and enough practice.
Maybe.
No, I mean, there's tons of studies on this. I mean, the world-class, world-class, the idea of world-class talent, if you look back, there's actually, when you look at the science around talent development, there's actually no evidence, like literally no evidence, that the idea of a child prodigy really exists. What you typically find is something more like this. You typically find, let's say, you have an 11-year-old daughter who, goes to her first track meet, and she's like an amazing runner, like amazing. Yeah. And you go, wow, that must be genetics. Well, what you typically find is that, well, actually, something like this happened. Typically, maybe her dad loved baseball, and so they were constantly playing baseball in the backyard. So she was constantly running around the bases from the age of 5 to 11. So by the time she got on that track field, she'd been running for 6 years. She'd been doing track without ever realizing that she was doing track. And so we misattribute these things. And you see this pattern again and again where, you see, for example, a lot of times, a lot of the origins of talent, it typically comes down to parents. So, maybe little Johnny, drew a painting when he was 5 years old. And the parents said, Johnny, this is a great painting, even though it wasn't very great, but they're supportive parents. Yeah. And so Johnny's like, oh, this is a way to get positive feedback. Like, this feels good. I'm going to keep doing this. And then he just kept doing it. Eventually, he actually became pretty good at it. And the positive feedback started coming not just from his parents, but other people. And it becomes sort of self-fulfilling and self-perpetuating. And so, the idea that, all these creative talents and creative greats that we think of who all started as children, somehow just happened to live in the right place at the right time, and they happened to have parents who were supportive of those exact talents, it doesn't meet the sort of bar of logic. It's Tiger Woods' dad was obsessed with golf, and he wanted Tiger to be great at golf. Mozart's dad always wanted to be a great musician, and he wanted to live vicariously through Mozart and hired him literally the best music teachers in all of Europe. Like, this is what you see over and over again, is that when you actually look at these stories and you look at the stories of great talent, they're typically not the stories of someone just happening into some skill and happening to be world class at it. No, it's almost always a story of an incredible amount of hard work, usually started very, very young, usually under the pressure or the sort of or the sometimes a lack of pressure because someone's trying to achieve the sort of the love of their parents. And they start this very young. It's not usually the story of someone, sat down at the piano for the first time at 25 and was somehow great at it.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly see that. But, I've also seen child prodigies. I had a great friend who, from kindergarten on, who could draw like a picture from 5 years old and never took an art class. And then you see Michael Phelps, who has, the perfect body for swimming. And then you see, who are the best marathoners in the world all come from one country. And yes, they have to run to get water, right? But their bodies and evolution, and maybe this is a much broader discussion. But I do get your point, and I do appreciate it, and I do agree that it is a lot of that.
Yeah, and there's a book out there that talks about this that comes out June 12th called The Creative Curve. But the thing I'll tell you is that the field of talent development is actually a very, very is actually a pretty deep field. There's a lot of research in here, and the thing I'll leave you with is that the academics and the researchers who spent all their time on this will tell you with consensus, not 100% consensus, but it's high, that the idea of natural born talent outside of very physical tasks, so like basketball, you have to be tall, but there are short basketball players. There is no real thing when it comes to sort of pure natural born talent. There is so much social context to talent development that's impossible to unspool from the actual talent itself. You over and over again, whether it's, you see these stories of, these kids who had these terrible childhoods and they always had a chip on their shoulder. And eventually they found they found maybe a mentor in their community who drew them into a specific task, and that chip on their shoulder drove them to practice more than anyone else ever did. And they become very good at something. And, the professors and the researchers who look at this, you see there's a surprising amount of consensus that the idea of natural talent doesn't exist.
And you see it kind of cutting both ways with like dyslexia, where there's a disproportionate number of successful people with dyslexia, but there's also a disproportionate number of prisoners with dyslexia. And that, how somebody managed a learning handicap, had a dramatic effect on their life. So
100%.
Yeah. Hey, so tell us more about the book. When's it come out? How do you get it?
June 12th. You can get it anywhere books are sold. The book website is thecreativecurve.com. There's snippets, there's reviews, book trailer, all sorts of good stuff.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that discussion. I really enjoyed talking to Alan about it. Hey, please make sure you're checking out the course offerings I have on Start the Conversation, Get the Meeting, as well as How to Win the Complex Sale by simplifying it. You can find them both at b2brevenue.com, and then there's training at the top. Just hit the tab, and it'll take you to the training page. Also, if you want to talk about the classes to see if they're the right fit for you, or if you think they might be better off customized to your particular needs, I offer both. You can do it as is with the office hours, which is every other Friday for an hour. I answer all questions. In the meantime, between Fridays, I answer them as well via video that's put into the course. So it's a living course, an active course. It's not something you just take and you're done. It's not just about observing and learning. It's about doing, getting feedback, and doing it again to get better at it. We all know how to sell, or most of us do, but selling is something that we have to perform at every time we do it. We don't get much credit for our education or what we did last month. We have to do it all over again every time. So you can check that out at B2B Revenue. I also have a free ebook there on how companies make purchasing decisions and product selections. That's free. Just register there. It gets emailed to you. And I really appreciate everybody's talking about the podcast, getting lots of great feedback. Anybody you'd like to see on the show or you'd like to be on the show, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and hit me up. I'll send you a calendar link. We'll get you on the interview calendar. I love different people's perspective. I'd really like to get this to be kind of a peer-to-peer type of podcast and really surface what's working today. And I hope you got a little bit out of this episode about creativity. Please make sure you're checking out the partners at gong.io. They did a great blog post this week on sales reps being part of the brand, because they're the face. They're the differentiator between all of these different products. Also, Pipedrive and Nudge. This is my CRM and my market intelligence AI prospecting tool. You can get both of the professional versions for free for 1 month with the Brutal Truth coupon code. And what else? Discover.org. How can I forget about my friends at Discover.org? Had a big announcement this week. They're teaming up with Bombora. I had the CEO of Bombora on earlier this year, if you can just page down and find him, where we're talking about people in market. Now, what does this mean? This means people who are reading periodicals, who are going to review sites. They're basically, leaving little digital breadcrumbs about what they care about, what they're looking for, what they're reading about. And wouldn't that be nice to know as far as to advertise to them, to sell to them? Because they're not yet converted on our website, but they are looking and learning out in the marketplace, showing curiosity. So it's almost as good as them, getting the Google data of what they're searching for. But it's even more important what they're reading and what they care about. So check that press announcement out at discoverorg.com. Katie and my friend Hank are over there. And I hope to have them on the show shortly to give an update to the audience about that. But that's what you need, is real, complete, clean, accurate data all in one place. And that's what Discover.org does for you. I've been a huge user of it, and it really is a major time savings. A lot of people hire people to do that, but for pennies on the dollar, why not just buy it and have somebody else do all that work for you? So check out the connection with Bombora and in-market activity. That was something that me and Katie talked about a few months ago on the podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.